research in progress. This is a session that the library started several years ago, where we ask faculty members to come in, talk to their colleagues, talk to their peers, talk to others interested, talk to groups of students about the kinds of research they're doing and things that aren't necessarily finished yet. It is research that is in progress and will continue. This gentleman has a healthy body of work already done, so he will be continuing it. Let me introduce to you those of you who do not know him personally. Professor Ernesto Castañeda. He is in the Department of Sociology. His research is on migration, urban issues, health disparities, vulnerable populations, and social movements. He's conducted surveys as well as ethnographic research in the United States, France, Mexico, Switzerland, Mexico, Algeria, and Morocco. He has published with Routledge, which is a very fine publisher in this area, and the library has a standing order to get every monograph published by them because they are a fine publisher. And today he's talking about understanding and fighting inequality. And we were chatting right before, but we had a speaker here last week who filled the SIS Founders Room with law school classes as well as students from this campus, who is the author of the book called The Color of Law. And I recommend it to you highly. It's a book that goes through the history of financing of housing in the United States and how the U.S. government, along with local jurisdictions, very systematically disenfranchised African Americans from buying homes where they could afford them and where they could have built wealth. And his book really points out, and particularly when students began asking questions about how could this happen and what are the long-term effects. The long-term effects are that if you have unequal opportunities, if you can only rent, you will never accumulate the wealth that one does when a house appreciates. If you can only rent in a neighborhood where you might be losing money, you not only don't accumulate wealth, you may lose what you invested. He was very deliberate in going through this, and when students said, and what can we do about it, he said, you can start on another civil rights movement. That's what it takes to deal with inequality in groups. So I'm hoping that your talk today will give us a few more insights into how do you deal with these inequality within groups.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nancy, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. So without further ado, well, I also heard that the Research in Progress series is to highlight the 2030 agenda of the university. So I want to say that I'm affiliated with the Sociology department, as Nancy said, but I'm also a member of the Center on Health, Risk, and Society, Center for the Latin American and Latino Studies here at AU, and also a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Center. And these three groups are part of the 2030 initiative. So I want to start by asking you, what produces inequality? And when you think about that, what comes to mind? Yes?
Circumstances of your birth.
Okay, yes, where you were born, who your parents are, sure, your family location. What else would be something that would come to mind? So that's fine, but probably in your head, it's, or another way to ask it is, what produces success? And the individual level, and you can say, well, hard work, right? It's a very individualistic, meritocratic society, so we think that merit, the people that succeed are the people that deserve it. You may think that it's intelligence. You are at a fine institution, so you had to go through good grades, good SAT to get here and other places. So that's the way we may think, right? Also that education is important, that's why we are here. Luck may play a role in this. And these are all individual traits, right? We think in terms of individuals, whether they do well in a class, in a corporation, or not. The flip of the coin would be to ask what produces failure, right? And we have these folk theories that people that are poor is because they are lazy, they don't work hard, they didn't go to school, so they deserve their lot in the socioeconomic structure. So this is, again, a kind of common way that some novels, maybe journalism or everyday life, people may think about why some people do well and others don't. And again, it's not that this doesn't matter. This matters, right? In a classroom, to a large degree in academia, all these things play a role. But what I'm trying to say today is that at a larger level, globally, this is not what produces inequality or success between groups, among groups, right? So something that I want to talk about is a relational approach to inequality. What do I mean by relational? Meaning that day and night, right? Black and white, that for somebody to be poor, you have somebody that may be accumulating resources, right? So you have to think about these processes in context, right? Relationally, not just individually, socially. So I'm going to be borrowing from the work of sociologist Charles Tilly, who died around 10 years ago. But he writes, for example, that much of what we observe as individual differences that create inequality are actually the consequences of categorical organization. For these reasons, inequality by race, gender, ethnicity, class, age, citizenship, etc., that may appear as different processes, he argues, are actually the result of similar processes of differentiation. So throughout the talk today, I'm going to try to show different evidence to convince you about this sociological insight. So I'm borrowing from one of my publications, which is more than anything a reader of the work of Charles Tilly, along with our colleague here at American University, Kathy Lisa Schneider. We compiled some of the works of Charles Tilly, and I'm going to concentrate today in parts of the book, the part 4, which is about inequality, poverty, and politics of exclusion, and also the parts on race and ethnicity and how they produce inequality. He worked on other topics, but that's what I will talk for the most part today. So he starts his book. We're in a library, so I'm going to talk a lot about books. I'm going to talk about my book work, not so much about other work, but the work that I have produced lately in books. So in the Tilly Reader, there's this chapter that starts with a story, right? Based in historical records and the work of historians. So for example, Tilly here observes that at the beginning of the 19th century, if you looked at people that were in the Marine society, you will see important differences in height, right? So the poor people joining the army or the Marine were 4 feet and 3 inches tall in average, for example. And then the people that were part of the military aristocracy, people that had a more successful upbringing, they will be taller, right? So that's something, again, that in 19th century you could see class, socioeconomic class, imprinted in the body in average height amongst groups, right? So there's Tilly and these authors claim that phrases that we use in English today, like high and mighty, haughty, looking down on someone, come from this realistic history, right? That the body represented where you were raised in poverty or wealth and the different nutrition. So we have Tanner here saying that variation between the height of individuals within a subpopulation is indeed largely dependent on difference in genetic endowment. The variation between the means of groups of individuals reflects the cumulative nutritional, hygienic, disease, stress experiences. But within group variation is due to heredity, and most of the between group variation is due to childhood environment. So I was trying to say, when you have a group that is pretty privileged, successful, then yes, merit, luck, hard work is going to determine who is on top and who is on bottom to a degree. But when you're looking at within categorical groups, which I'll explain in a minute what that means, then these differences are due to larger processes than what individuals do. And one kind of funny, interesting example that I don't think it applies anymore today, but in the 19th century, height in England amongst people of different ranks in the Marines or in the Army could tell you that class difference. All right, so a brief background to other theories, a literature review or theories. If you read Marx in your classes, you know that he talks a lot about the processes of exploitation, process of exploitation through which people that own the means of production, he says, factories, companies, they accumulate the profits, and the workers, you get the wages. And that produces, through time, a difference between the rich and the poor. So that's the classic Marxist understanding. Weber then comes and says that it's not only about economic resources, but also about status, social status. So teachers, professors, priests, they may not make a lot of money, but they have certain respect of society, and that also can be, has a value socially, right? So Charles Tilly doesn't disagree with Marx and Weber on these lines, but he also adds then another process that he calls opportunity hoarding, that it's not only accumulation of resources, accumulation of prestige, and symbolic goods, Bourdieu will call them, but it's also that you give your in-group access to opportunities, to jobs, to information that is going to make them wealthier as a group. And again, he's not saying that people have bad intentions, but it is natural for us to help the people in our families, our networks, our environment. So that's going to result in group inequality through time. So I focus here today about what I call durable categorical inequalities, following the work of Tilly. And by that I mean not so much differences between individuals, everything else being equal, but difference between groups, and differences that pass through generations and that are not based on intrinsic biological differences, but in different accesses to resources based on real or imputed belonging to a category. So you may see yourself as Latino or black or not, but if people assume that you are and put you in that box, that may have consequences, right? So that's what we mean here. And these differences, these categorical groups, are nothing ontologically true. They are nothing set in stone. They are nothing God-given, you could say. It's something that changes in different time periods and different historical moments, right? So today we can talk about difference between female and male. At one point, the difference between aristocrats and plebeians was something relevant, not so much anymore, not in the US. Citizen-foreigner is a distinction that I'll talk a lot about today. And also differences between religious affiliation, ethnic or race is something that historically has been present in different forms, right? We have the caste system in India. We have different systems of inequality in different times and places. But Tilly argues that it's the same mechanism. It's all about categorical differences resulting in different opportunities and access. The sociologist W.B. Dubois, 100 years ago, said that race was being used as a biological explanation for what he understood to be social and cultural differences between different populations of people. He spoke out, Dubois, against the idea of white and black as discrete groups, claiming that these distinctions ignore the scope of human diversity. And this is Gannon, and this is in Nature. This is scientists talking about genetic differences and about genetic tests, and they are saying that we shouldn't be too fast in attributing difference in outcomes to genetic differences, and it's something that Du Bois was talking about 100 years ago. So race is an example of categorical inequality, or a socially constructed category that is really sticky, and we still treat as true very often. But one of the conclusions of this work is that racial projects are time and place specific. They are not based on biological truths or visible skin color, because there's a variation. And I know it's a big claim. I'll try to back it up with our examples and look forward to questions and answers towards the end. But what I'm doing today is showing you a relational approach to inequality or inequalities. I'm going to use the work of Charles Tilly and my own research, but that's not we're not the only people who use this term. Pierre Bourdieu, a famous French sociologist, uses the terms of symbolic violence to talk about similar differences. He writes about gender differences. He talks about fields, how in different artistic fields, so poetry, or different academic fields, there's games that people play to jockey around status and get the first places. But he doesn't really, as a good French person, he doesn't want to talk about religion, race, or ethnicity, right? They don't exist. They are not legitimate, something that I will talk about later. But it's also a relational view of inequality, but again, it doesn't apply very well for the American context when it comes to nationality, race, ethnicity. There's a lot of other people, Michel Lamont, Andreas Weimer, and Laurent, that use similar approaches to inequality today. We also have people that use this approach to talk about immigration, Mary Romero, Marcelo Bort at SIS, and Eduardo Maria Silva uses, I will say, a similar theoretical approach to understand race not as an individual, or racism, not as an individual trait, but as something social, right? And these are people that the department and the university has invited to campus, as you may have heard. So that was kind of in words. I'm going to explain it graphically. Maybe it's easier to understand. It's a very simple, you could say, simplistic model. But again, a lot of very respected social scientists have used this simple theoretical scheme to explain these differences. So you can say that you have two groups, X and Y's. It could be gender. It can be anything, Zulus, Hutus. And you can say they start different in one degree, maybe different tribes, different families, different part of the world. And then you have mechanisms that reinforce their differences. So these social scientists talk about social boundaries, or symbolic boundaries, to differentiate one group from the other. Then you're going to have relationships within X's, meaning whites. Whites are going to have a privileged position in society. It doesn't mean that there are no poor whites, right? Or that all white people are doing extremely well in society. There's going to be a difference, right? There's going to be a hierarchy. Same thing within whites. You're going to have different blacks, and even in a slave society, you're going to have slaves working in the mansion with the masters in a more privileged position, and you're going to have slaves working in the fields in much tougher working conditions. So it doesn't mean that all the women have the same position in society, all the men, or whatever group you want. There's going to be differences, but what's going to be seen as naturally different is the differences between X's and Y's. And again, you can apply many examples to that example. Again, most of the time there's going to be relationships across the boundary, right? Intermarriage, it was maybe illegal, it was miscegenation, it couldn't be done, but it happened, right? There's a mulatto population in Orleans, etc. There were a lot of relations of different types, commercial. In Georgetown, right? Blacks and whites live next to each other. They have different freedoms and rights, but they were neighbors. So it doesn't mean that they live in different planets, but there's something social that makes them as if they were different. So what sustains this kind of fantasy of differentiation, Tilly says, is a shared set of stories, right? An understanding of the national or the group history, the tribal history, social boundaries, and conceptions of identity that, again, are based on narratives that people tell to themselves about themselves, and they hear about others or from others. So, again, a very simple model to talk about how at a particular historical time, people see one group as different from another. And there's a lot of boundary work, we say, to make these distinctions appear, and then stick, and then be reproduced across time and place. So then I'm going to talk about another book, Immigration and Categorical Inequality, which is a book I edited that came early this year. And my editors at Routledge encouraged me to publicize them a lot, so here they are. So I'm going to talk to them briefly, so if you're interested, you can read them, or you can get the gist out of it. A lot of people in the audience help giving me feedback and reading some of the chapters in all these projects. So this book provides theories of migration, just to understand what migration is in a very generic term, and I will discuss that one of the chapters briefly in a minute. It also provides socio-historical understandings of present inequalities and distinctions, mainly between citizens and immigrants in different societies. And it provides case studies, for example, a lot of on Latinos in the US, but also families of migrants from Nepal, Koreans living in Tokyo, in Japan, and how they are framed as different. They're all Asian, but there's a big difference. And a colleague from the University of San Francisco writes about that. And then a Catalan geographer writes about geographic distinctions in Barcelona for this book. So there are different cases, different places, but they're all about processes that create distinctions between groups. So let me start with one of the very theoretical chapters in the book, a very ambitious chapter by anthropologist Josiah Haman. And he does something that I think is useful for us to think about what I'm going to talk during the rest of the talk. So Haman draws on the work of Charles Tilly and his work on citizenship to refocus our approach to migration by combining in one single view the historical development of the nation state membership, which we call normally citizenship, and the internal and international migration. Haman argues that the characterization of newly arriving outsiders or immigrants makes sense only when you contrast the ground definition and clarification of insider citizens within the outsiders, right? And then he says, I'm critical of social, economic, and political accounts that focus only on immigrants or only on citizens, without seeing them as outcomes of simultaneous, if contrastive processes. So again, this is a relational approach, right? It only makes sense, and it's kind of obvious when I tell you, it only makes sense to talk about immigrants if we have citizens, right? If we don't have citizens, then there's not an immigrant, right? It's kind of obvious, but again, if you went back 500 years, these categories didn't really exist, right? It's a product of the formation of the nation state that Tilly wrote a lot about too, and also has a role to do with capitalism. It's a long quote, but let me explain it now using some of the graphs, and I'm just going to gloss over. If you're interested in the historical data, in more of the argument, I encourage you to read the chapter. But he has some diagrams there that I think help explain this deep historical theoretical concept graphically in a very simplified manner, right? So when we think about migration, at the beginning, we are talking about people moving short distances, locally, you could say. Mainly peasants moving into cities, right? So we have former peasants, again, if you're from a rural family, there's a time when there's too many children for them to inherit land, right? So some of them need something else to do. They go into a religious service, they go into the military, or they go into the city, right? That's what happens historically in most parts of the world. So that was a non-issue. You move to a city when you have work, right? When you have the formation of capitalism and the beginning of the consolidation of the nation state, there's a big demand from the state for people to serve in the military, for people to pay taxes, and then you have the beginning of a stigmatization of people moving around, because the government wants to know where people are so they can tax them and recruit them better. So movement starts becoming a little problematic for Louis XIV or different feudal lords, right? So you start having a lot of capitalist development in cities. As we move forward, then you start having that the local peasants have already moved to the big cities around, so you need people to come from further away, right? And these times you could be, okay, they're still coming from within France, they're still coming within the German territories. But what happens when a city becomes too big, Paris, London, then you start having the development of new sites of production, right? New cities where people are starting to move because starting to become crowded and expensive to do your production, textile production in Manchester. Then you have later on the people that used to come from outside, the peasants that used to move to a city, then they start having children, right? And they are no longer interlopers. They are not outsiders anymore. Now they are New Yorkers or Parisians or Londoners because they were born there. And then the children, this is our city. We don't want anybody from outside. But they used to be former peasants, right? So then you have to start having this maturation of ideas of identity, mainly connected to the city. But later on, as the state becomes more as you have education systems and you start having the external border meaning something more meaningful, you start having the development of belonging, patriotism, then these identities become more important. All right, so then as this process continues, and again, at different speeds, in different orders, in different places of the world, but it's a model that you can apply in different cases. Then you have a point when you don't have enough people locally, labor becomes expensive. So you need more workers, right? To continue growing as a city, as a capitalistic system, we always need to be growing, right? Thus, this obsession today with GDP and growth, economic growth, right? That's been there for a couple centuries. So we need people to come either from outside, what we call today international migrants, to provide this labor supply, or you move your sites of production to other places, right? Or you import now agricultural goods and other inputs from other countries, or you set your shop abroad. So when you set your factories abroad, Mexico and China in the case today, you're going to have people feeling threatened by globalization, and that's something that it's very obvious today, right? You're going to have increasingly fortified borders. You're going to have people locally being wary about foreign elements in our midst, right? Because you have this nation state formed. Everybody's supposed to have the same allegiance to the flag. Everybody is supposed to have the same language. So the foreigners are a threat to this idea that is relatively new, right? 200, 300 years, which for the span of humanity is very recent. So that's kind of the overall theoretical argument that Haman makes. In broad strokes, and then he provides a little more detail, much more detail about the particular case of the United States, which is different. You have, for example, a system in the north, for example, Boston with Irish migration, and then you have a different economic system in the south, right, the slavery. So at one point, then you have mass migration from Europe that provides all this cheap labor for the growth of a lot of cities throughout the United States, the north and the west. And then because you have the south, and then you have the emancipation of slavery, you have the Great Migration, which are people coming from the south of the US to Chicago, Detroit, you name it. and they are citizens, and they are within the political, economic border of the nation state. But as we know, they have different rights, they are seen different, right? There's a stigma. They are seen as outsiders, and they're also seen as racial others, right? So it's not the segregation and these other stories and facts that you know very well. So that's why Haman says we shouldn't just talk about immigrants when they come from outside, but we have to also look about this mobilization of people, movement of people from one place to the other, even if it's within the same borders, because they are fulfilling a demand for labor, right? And they're going to have big consequences. Politically, socially, etc. So that's going to be the main point. And then at one point you have then the end of Asian migration at the beginning again, and then you have the Mexican labor. I'll talk more about that. But again, that's just one chapter of this book that has a lot of, I think it's making a very broad, a very bold theoretical statement. I think it's very useful for us to understand how migration doesn't happen by itself, right? It's fulfilling both the growth of the systems of production that need more workers, but also how this border is fictitious, and it only happened, again, since the 1700s, but how this process of the continuous need for workers to move across places, across distances, and this idea of solidifying a national border, they contradict each other, right? It's something that's been with us for centuries now, but it doesn't have to, right? Another thing that Tilly and I discussed in the introduction to this book is this concept of chain migration. And I'm going to talk about it briefly because it's in the news. Administration uses it today to discredit or to try to end family reunification. And a lot of people in op-eds and all that is like, oh, that's not a real term, that's prerogative, that sounds horrible, it sounds like a chain reaction and it's dangerous. But it's actually a term that Tilly and other demographers and economists in the 60s used to talk about a process that is also, I would say, universal across time and place. And it is when people come into a new area and they have a job in a deli or something, and then the employer says, hey, I want somebody as good as you. Hey, Max, do you know somebody else in your hometown that can come and work with me next summer? Oh, yeah, let me bring my cousin, my brother, right? So you go back home, because a lot of this migration was temporary. And when the borders were more weekly policed, people came back and forth all the time. That was the case with Mexican immigrants in the US for almost 100 years. So little by little, you start bringing your compadres, your neighbors, your family members to fulfill this labor demand, right? So then what starts as an individual, a pioneer, a seed, it becomes then in his extended network moving to the new place, right? So when you go to particular places in the world, the immigrant communities are from Sicilia, or they are from a part of Algeria, or a particular place in the world, right? It's not random who migrates where. So chain migration makes it easier for the newcomers to find other people like them, to support each other. And then it's funny because then people start listening about opportunities for housing, for jobs, in particular regions, right? So they start not self-segregating, but they start concentrating in particular parts of town. So you have then, and Chicago in the early 1900s has this Italian town, right? The German town, the Jewish part of town, the black part of town that everybody knows. And then people start making associations. What part of town is dangerous? What part of town is thriving? What part of town you shouldn't go? But it's something that starts from a process of workers coming to a new site, and again, kind of pooling resources, but then it becomes, Tilly says, that cities, because of this process, are the factories of race and ethnicity. Race doesn't exist, ethnicity doesn't exist, unless you have these groups of people that are supposedly different. And in this case, they speak different languages, they may look different, they may dress different. So they live next to each other, so they say, oh, there goes the Polish, there goes the Irish guy. And then you start having this ethnicity that only kind of occurs at these phases of migration in urban places when you have concentrations of these groups. So, and then they form trust networks, they support each other, they help each other get jobs and all that. And he talks about detail about the importance of trust networks for trade, democracy, and other things. But then this results then in the concentration of people in places, right? Segregation. And here, Pau Serra del Pozo, this geographer from Catalonia, from Barcelona, he then maps, for example, the highest concentration of the foreign-born. And as you will see in Barcelona, particular neighborhoods like El Raval have the highest concentration of immigrants. And if you walk the streets of Barcelona, you see that in the streets, right? So then this geographic reality correlates with mental maps that people make of don't go to that part of town, right? This is stigmatized places that I call. So And then you can start doing other type of geographical analysis and say that, for example, a concentration of the foreign born correlates with the number of immigrant associations, which shouldn't be surprising, but Barcelona allows for that to happen. For example, in Paris, you may have a lot of concentration of North Africans in certain parts of Paris, but that doesn't mean that there are going to be a lot of mosques or a lot of organizations, because the French don't like those type of ethnic, self-segregating organizations. And I will talk more about that in a minute. All right, so that's just another example about processes that happen by individuals, but then when you aggregate them, you have these, what looks like self-segregation by immigrants, but it does not mean, like some pundits say, that immigrants don't want to integrate, that immigrants don't want to talk to others, that immigrants don't want to learn English, Catalan, German, whatever the case may be. It's just that it's an early stage and they arrive in groups, because we are social animals. Another chapter by Douglas Massey, a very distinguished sociologist, demographer, and an expert on Mexico-U.S. migration, talks about the importance of migration and categorical inequality, but he also asks a question in part of the chapter of whether Caribbean immigrants in the U.S. do the same, right? Because some people say, well, all Latinos are the same, right? So then people, no, Mexicans are different from South Americans, and it's different in Puerto Rico. But then somebody could say, well, but the Caribbeans, because they are in the islands, they're in the Caribbean, the same weather, the same stock, they are going to behave the same, right? They're going to do the same in the U.S. But if that culturalistic argument was right, then you'll have Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans equally represented in the Senate. But they are not, as you know, right? It's more Cuban. So then he writes about why that happens. And I'm not going to read the quotes right now because we're running out of time, but I have it summarized here. So he provides more background, more backing up for this. But for example, he argues that Puerto Ricans was a wave that came first into the East Coast from Latin America and the Caribbean. They were originally, for the most part, in average, working class people. And they were citizens, right, because of the U.S.-Spanish War. Puerto Rico became part of the U.S. territory, so they have citizenship in paper, right? But if you go to New York, the Puerto Ricans, in average, they tend to not do very well economically. Italians and other groups have surpassed them. Cubans, on the other hand, because of the revolution in Cuba, it was the elites, people with capital, education, that escaped. And not only they came to the U.S., but they were given refugee status on the moment they arrived, or early on when they were leaving. This has changed recently, but at the point they were seen as political refugees escaping Soviet influence. So they were seen as heroes. They were welcomed. They were providing housing, support, and no wonder they did very well. They were able to get educated. They went to college, and most of them are doing pretty well. Businesses, or you have a lot of people in Congress and other different. They're a success story in terms of immigration, but because there was a selection from the beginning, right? It's not that they are more hard workers than the Puerto Ricans or the Dominicans. The Dominicans, because of the U.S. intervention in Dominican Republic after the fall of its dictator, the upper classes were doing pretty well, so they stayed. The working classes didn't have the resources to come to the U.S., so it was mainly middle-class people that came to the East Coast. With visas that they overextended, many of them are undocumented now, so they're lower middle class, right? Mexicans, for the most part, historically, they came to work in agriculture in the West, working class, peasant origin. Many of them, undocumented, again, it's only 0.5% of a big population. And how they are doing, well, it depends, right? Because there's third, fourth generation Mexican Americans who are solidly middle class, but you have people that just arrived, undocumented, that are struggling. So it's up to many things what's going to happen to the population in the future. Will be a permanent underclass in the U.S., or it will be another ethnic group that becomes white. That's still up in the air, I think. All right, but again, up in the air, but depending on a lot of processes and a lot of things that we do as citizens and that our society does and says about laborers. So one chapter that we have, a student of mine and me, is looking at day laborers in Long Island. And what we see is that these people work, they get jobs, they get hired every day to do particular jobs, work on a bathroom, on a garden, on a little construction, doing these piecemeal jobs. But then there are processes that kind of keep them apart or outside of the mainstream. So one of the processes that I talk about is with Kevin is flash hirings, right? Which I'll explain in a moment. So flash hirings happen when, so we're in Depot Road, one street in Long Island. We noticed that there were generally two categories of employers who relied on day labor. The first were contractors, who owned small businesses and hired immigrant workers for landscaping, construction, etc. These small businesses were not really comfortable talking with day laborers. These are people from Central America for the most part. Some undocumented, some had TPS, temporary protective status. They would stop their vehicles inside the day labor and hire inside, and they will negotiate prices. They will say, do you know how to use this machine? Show me. So it was a professional type of contracting, not like anybody else. Then the situation that is more, we'll say, exclusionary or marking of these differences is where private employers would come. So these employers did not operate businesses, but sought to hire temporary labor to work in their homes or yards or small private jobs. They drove not large trucks that were typical of landscaping or construction, but small cars or SUVs. These employers were afraid of the hiring site and therefore picked up workers only on the streets outside of it. They would only momentarily stop their cars, signal hand gestures of how many workers they needed, and they would desire the numbers of workers enter their cars. They would speed away and escape. They were afraid of being seen. They thought that they were doing something illegal. And in the chapter, I compare it to, for example, sex labor or other things that are stigmatized because it's literally illegal to hire illegals to do work under the table without paying taxes. Yet, I guess most American citizens do it, right? So it is, at the same time, they have this demand for labor and this employment through subcontractors or hiring ourselves directly. But then there's this stigma that these people shouldn't be here and they should be doing the work, yet all of them are employed. Most of them are employed, right? So there's this contradiction that we keep seeing, right? And the day laborers, they experience this. One morning, we observed two small luxury vehicles quickly pick up a pair of workers and then flee as if they were being chased. The laborers lining in the streets of the Depot Road laughed in chorus as the tires from one of the cars screeched as the employer attempted to make a quick getaway. So for the workers, it was comical because they are good guys and not going to commit any crime, but they see how people are, you could say, afraid of them. And it's true because if you're an employer and you arrive into the employment side, there may be 10 people looking for jobs, so they all approach the cars like, me, pick me. And then some of the workers were telling us that some of the employers are afraid they're going to scratch their car or they're going to dirty the car. Sometimes these are luxury cars. So there's this tension between the employer and the employee, but again, at the end of the day, these people do the work. What we found is a lot of the times people are not paid. They get picked up, they are taken and say, hey, please do this job and all that. And you have 3 days to do it. And then the workers see so much that they take 4 days, and then they tell the workers, well, I'm sorry, you didn't do it on time, you're not going to get paid. And that was the end of the story. And because these people are undocumented, they didn't feel they have any recourse to go to a lawyer or to make a complaint. Legally, they have, as laborers, they have labor rights, but they don't know it. And it's very hard to have these people get paid. So a lot of the employers were taking advantage of them by low wages, which is the norm, but also by just wage theft, as it's called. But then also one of the workers tells us that, there's many great employers, but some say that jornaleros, or their laborers, it's like, how many of us are here? We live in the darkness. I want to go out of the darkness. Racists, they don't want to see you, the migrant worker. We're like animals. We are purely viewed. No lunch, no water. Do they want to give us? They go to the host, fill a pitcher, add a piece of ice, and say, here's your water. We give our lives for the employers, and they treat us like animals. They want to exchange gold for silver. So this is kind of, in Spanish, they're telling us that they see this as deeply unequal, deeply unjust, deeply dehumanizing. They compare themselves to animals. But then it's not even like animals, right? The animals have personal veterinarians. The Americans put us below the dogs and the cats. The dogs have their house. They are taken care of. They have vitamins. They receive injections for parasites. Why do animals have more than us? They don't say, poor man, it's poor dog. In the stables, the horses live better than us. So Carlos, and this is an extreme example, but again, it's kind of, these are people that are part of the economic ecosystem of Long Island, but they don't feel that they are recognized as human. And this is an example that they say that the animals they see in the houses they work at have a better life than they do. So what I argue is that the category of the illegal is something that comes again from this historical formation of the nation state and then people crossing boundaries without permission. But then it's something that employers and in this case it's piecemeal, citizen employers then kind of take advantage of to treat these workers with no rights, right? They don't have to be paid minimum wage. They don't have any immigrant rights. They don't have job stability. And then it's something that working class whites or blacks or immigrants say it's not fair. They're competing against us. And it's true that they may be affecting somebody else that would be doing that job for a little higher pay. But it's not the fault of the immigrant, right? It's kind of the system giving less rights to these people because there's a boundary that then it makes it more exploitable for the employers. All right, so that's a little bit about that edited book. Then, since I'm talking about books, I'm going to tell you briefly about my monograph that is coming with Stanford University Press in May of 2018, in a month. And this I'm looking at similar processes, in particular in three cities, New York, Paris, and Barcelona. So for this, as Nancy was saying, I did extensive ethnographic work. I started the field work in New York in 2013, like 15 years ago. I spent 10 years ago in Paris and Barcelona. And then I wanted to understand the immigrant experience from the point of view of the immigrants. So something that a lot of immigration scholars do is that the immigrant or the person is born or exists once they cross the border, right? So somebody becomes a problem or a person or an issue or socially visible once they arrive into Paris, into New York, like they were just born, like they didn't have a life back in Africa or back in Asia. And it's not true, right? People come with a culture, with a language, with family left behind, with expectations. So for me, it was very important to look at the immigrant both as somebody that left and somebody that arrived, not just somebody born once they cross the border. So the sending context and the culture matter. So for that reason, I went and I did field work in Mexico, in communities that send a lot of people in this chain migration to New York. Also throughout Morocco, Algeria, and then I did a bunch of surveys, different sizes, different samples. So I don't do any quantitative work in the book because I don't have enough sample size to do anything quantitative in the book. But I use this for the stories that they tell me, the narration. So I look at migration in two different ways. One of it is kind of the objective indicators of integration. Do people have jobs? Do people have access to healthcare? The stuff that as American citizens, if you want to see the US is becoming more equal or better, is life expectancy going up or down. And we have numbers for that, right? There's people that do this in a quantitative way and kind of create indexes for immigrant integration in Europe, especially. What I did is I used an historical comparative method to look at different institutions and different histories to see how immigrants fit in these particular national stories. But I wanted to compare this kind of objective indicator. Do you have a job? Do you have healthcare? Do you have a house? With where you feel at home, where you feel that you belong, where you feel that you're integrated or you are segregated, right? So for that, you have to talk to the people, right? So I did interviews and I did a lot of ethnography, so hanging out with immigrants in these three cities. So you could say, well, you're comparing apples and oranges. What's the commonality here? And you can say that. But there's something in common within these sending and receiving places is that many of the relationships are between former colonies, right? Why do Algerians in Northern Africa, why do they go in large numbers to France and not to the US? A colony. They were a colony, right? Same, the north of Morocco used to be a colony of Spain. Mexico and Spain, further back, but they were a colony. And you can talk about territorial wars and a complicated relationship between the US and Mexico. So that's a little bit of what I did thinking about this comparative historically. And then funny enough, the language difference and similarities and the religion, languages, and similarities that pundits make a lot of, and I thought will explain a lot, welcoming or rejecting somebody, work in a much more complex way. I can talk more about it, but it doesn't help a lot a Mexican in Barcelona that they speak Spanish. It doesn't mean that they are at home, right? And also the fact that Latinos are Christians and most Americans are Christians also doesn't do away with this boundary, right? So it's more complex than how Huntington or other people frame it. The contexts are very different, so you have to take these cities as different. They're going to do the integration of immigrants differently, and that's fine. So for example, in New York, it's up to the immigrants to integrate. I call it laissez-faire. the immigrants, they let them do. If they can figure out a way to hustle and survive, good for them. If not, they can go back. It's pretty much kind of this competitive environment. Immigrants in Paris are expected to become French really fast, really well, and there is little real support to do that. In Barcelona, the immigrants are given the resources to learn Catalan, to integrate, but also they are not expected to forget about their religion or their language or their culture. They are expected to become bicultural, you could say. So they can be Pakistani, Catalan, and then work and do a lot of stuff in Spanish. So this multicultural thing, it's taken for granted and encouraged, partly because you have Catalans as a minority within Spain. So they've been fighting for their cultural rights as a nation within a larger nation state. So they are applying the same model to immigrants. So immigrants were really happy there, especially before the economic crisis when there were more jobs. So I could say that New York has a multicultural environment. Paris is a stereotype, but it's also pretty true. You have to assimilate to the mainstream culture. That's the way that the US used to be 80, 100 years ago. I don't think anymore that, these are people saying different expectations. But in reality, I think we're a multicultural society, and so is the case in Barcelona. In Paris, you don't get very far away if you want to do everything, everyday life in Arabic. You're not going to be taken seriously. In the US, you can. There's more legitimacy for making claims on an ethnic basis, largely thanks to the legacy of the civil rights. We have that avenue to talk about differences between groups and argue that you can ask for equality as Black, as Jewish, as LGBT. It's something that there's not a history of in France, and something that in France they fight against, and it has consequences for these individuals. And it's something that Barcelona has created a space for this to occur. Another of my kind of historical comparative tables, there's a lot in here, but just to say that in terms of this variable, avenues for political voice and collective action, there's a lot of that in New York, not in Paris, and you have some of that in Barcelona. So you can organize amongst other Moroccans and have a social movement around getting papers for Moroccans, right, or for a particular group. And this is something that immigrants don't have access to in Paris. So kind of the conclusions of the book, I feel that in terms of objective measure, in terms of these constructs, immigrants in New York feel highly at home after a while. In Paris, even though they may have papers and citizenship, they don't feel as at home if they are a minority religion or a minority North African, the case that I study. And in Barcelona, people, even if they are from Morocco or from Latin America, after a while, they do feel at home. So again, this kind of comparing of immigrant integration, you can measure it doing surveys, you can measure it, look at life expectancy, income, many things that you can get quantitatively. But I think the best way to know if somebody feels integrated, if immigrants are successful, is by asking them, right? How you do, how you feel, do you feel at home or not? And they will tell you soon enough, right? So what I do is I contrast this objective integration, or again, it's a fact that most immigrants in France are citizens, therefore they have free healthcare, very good housing, free access to the subway if they're unemployed, have all these benefits that we will die for in America and we don't have. But then they should be doing pretty well, but it doesn't translate always, right? So they don't have this urban belonging that I call of subjective integration. So I have this kind of heuristic graph that I have in the book, and the best outcome would be when you have, if you were a public policy major, you can say, in order to integrate immigrants well, we're going to give them citizenship rights, job opportunities, access to education, and we're also going to make it so that they feel at home, right? So that's when you're integrated. You actually, in reality, have a lot of things helping you succeed, and you also feel that you belong, right? That's kind of the best outcome. None of these cities is perfect. And again, maybe this is just a dream, but it's good to aim for that, right? But so you have, so I compare, and you learn a lot from comparisons, I think. So Mexicans in New York, many of them don't have papers. Many of them live in an apartment, many families. They can be fired anytime. They can be deported, even though it's a sanctuary city, you can still be deported, and people are deported all the time. So objectively, they are so-so, right? They are not up here. But in terms of being able to have restaurants, play their music, have parades, have events in public, they have that. So they can carve a place to feel at home while they are lacking a lot objectively. But in one of the chapters, they talk about Mexicans feeling as New Yorkers, right? So they have this urban belonging that is very important. North Africans in Barcelona feel a lot at home, and they suffer racism and discrimination. Catalanes and Spanish prefer Latin Americans, but despite all that, Moroccans, when they have a job and they give an opportunity, they feel pretty fast at home. They learn Catalan. They were really, really, really integrated when you ask them. If you ask the Spanish, they were like, no, those people they commit crime, they are bad, they are not doing well. But actually, if you look at it objectively and subjectively, they were doing pretty well, especially before the crisis. The crisis made a lot of them go back, but the ones that stayed are doing okay. Latinos in Barcelona is funny because they're actually doing pretty well, but they thought that it would be just like piece of cake. I speak Spanish. I'm from my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Spanish, so I'm going home, right? But it's like if you move to England, they'd be like, what are you doing here, Yankee, right? Or vice versa. So it's different. But people before migrating, they think that, oh, I don't need to learn English, so I'm going to go to Spain. It's going to be easier to find a job and succeed. And then North Africans in Barcelona have papers, have a lot of a real welfare state providing them services, but they are seen as non-French if they have Arabic phenotype. So they have this exclusion by the people, even though the state provides them a lot of benefits. So kind of the policy recommendation would be that what is good for immigrants is good for established residents and vice versa. So if you wanted to help immigrants, it's the same thing that you would do to help the locals. And then that way it does away with these fights between struggling citizens and newcomers that we see that some politicians take advantage of. But if you increase wages for everybody, that helps the locals and the immigrants, right? If you have a minimum wage, working hours, all these kind of benefits, if they apply universally, if they were not made distinctions legally or de facto between citizens and non-citizens, it will benefit everybody. Because cities need newcomers to grow. If you don't grow, you decline, right? So as Baltimore, as Detroit, how they are doing, they are losing population. They are in crisis, right? But Washington, D.C., we keep growing. We keep growing because people keep coming, right? People come study, they stay here. New headquarters established here. The city grows, right? And there's growing pains, there's a judgment, there's growing expenses, but the city is thriving, right? That's the only game in town. You grow or you decline. So it's the fact that immigrants are coming to a city or a country is a positive sign that the country is doing well, because not everybody can do well at the same time. It's a relational system, right? So a city that everybody can call home, that people can go to public spaces and enjoy, is good for newcomers and citizens. And that's what you see in a lot of the public spaces in New York. Different classes, different races, different ethnicities cohabit. They have different resources, and it's not perfect. But there's this commonality of urban places as home. So that's something positive. And the last kind of case study book I'm going to talk about is more about the border. And if living in the border is an area of contrast, but also of continuous crossings, right? People go, this is Ciudad Juarez, El Paso. People come and go all the time. Students come and go to classes. Corporate managers live in the U.S., work in maquilas in Mexico. There's a real exchange. It's a real bilingual, bicultural place. But you have then these courses and policies that break those create a boundary in the literal sense, right? So this is a book project that I'm talking to Roman and Littlefield to publish next year, 2019, and it's called Building Walls, Stereotypes and Interactions Between Mexicans and Americans, or vice versa. And the first part of the book is going to talk about living on the other side of the divide, so the experiences of Mexican immigrants in particular, living with the fear of deportation, being in New York integrated but being invisible. When you see movies, read stories about New York, the Latino element doesn't show up a lot, and the Mexican element very little. But around half of people in New York speak Spanish. But if you haven't lived there, you probably would never know that, right? And then the second part is kind of how theory and how this boundary process works so that a Mexican and an American means something different. What I say is an example of an X and Y. It doesn't have to be like that, especially in the US. That boundary could blurry, like Italian Americans, but it's becoming more bright, it's becoming more visible. So this building of walls in a literal and in a symbolic sense. So an historical example in one of the chapters that I talk about is that after the Chinese Exclusion Act and then the Japanese Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, this guy Haman, who was a clerk of the Senate in Connecticut, a lawyer, he talks about, well, I don't understand. You're asking first for the Chinese and Japanese to be excluded, and now you're asking me to allow you to bring more Mexican labor into California agricultural lands. This statesman is in a report, official report to the government in 26, saying how it doesn't make sense to him. And then he goes into stereotypes. And I'm just showing this to demonstrate that the stereotypes that we have of the discourse that is anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican today is nothing new. It's been around for at least 100 years. So it's not really a Trump phenomenon. Politicians take advantage of it because it's in the society at large. It's something that is available that then you can mobilize for political gain. But it's not something that he created. So it's not a before and after. It's a continuum. So in 26, Haman says, one can hardly avoid the conclusion that Mexicans in the U.S. appear to the majority of Americans as unassimilable, right? So it's something that Huntington says in the 2000s. It's something that Haman and many others were saying 100 years ago. Although these people now, you couldn't, these Mexican Americans now, they're as American as anybody else. You couldn't recognize them, right? Purposely avoiding cultural assimilation, concerned merely with their own economic advantage. Though it's probably due to the fact that they are not considered by Americans generally except as an attractive labor supply, and on the other hand, rather unique idealism to their natural land. So again, there's like, oh yeah, they're great workers, we want them, but they don't really want to be American. They want to go back home. So then we don't have to treat them as Americans. We don't have to welcome them as new members of our society. Then another committee established in California in the 30s says that of a lot of firms that they surveyed, most of them said that the Mexicans were satisfactory laborers and fitted for the work at which employed. And then they make some descriptions of Mexican labor. They were steady, good workers. They are desirable and efficient. We have found the labor satisfactory, efficient, and they are not quarrelsome or agitating. They don't have citizenship rights, so they're not going to complain and ask for more like Puerto Ricans or African Americans. That's the implication here. But then, so you have these positive things that the immigrants, the employers say they are great workers. But then at the same time, they complain about the cultural characteristics, right? So they're hard workers, but then they say, well, but they are lazy people, right? They're ignorant. They're not dependable. We don't want them as citizens, right? So this allure always of the guest worker, right? They come, they do the work when they are in their prime years, and then retire back home, right? Or send them, they don't want them as children here, we want them as laborers. And Germany, Italy, they did similar things with Turkish and other groups in other parts of the world. But there is contradiction between the labor done by Mexicans or other immigrant groups at the same time this kind of exclusion that we don't want them to be part of the society. So the last part to finish, kind of responding to Nancy's question, what do we do about this? So again, this is just examples of these differences. Why can we do about it? And Tilly, in that reader, he has this graph, says how do we overcome inequality? And then he says that one way to do it is passing, right? For one individual who may have a black family or a Latino family but looks white, they can pass, right? So that's something that individuals can do. It's good for them, but it doesn't change the boundary, right? It doesn't transform the system. It doesn't really produce an escape. So that's not transformative at the larger sense, right? You can create new channels, new avenues, something that transforms the system creatively, and that's when you have really good policy making or informed citizenry. There can be a lot of economic growth that it benefits a lot of people. After World War II, the GI Bill benefited the Irish, the Italian. Many ethnic groups became white, right? The Germans stopped being German after World War II because they didn't want to be associated with Hitler, so they became white, right? You can also have a few people crossing the boundary, or he says that the most extreme way to do it is to have a revolution and you change the categories. The problem with revolutions is that you have then we have the French Revolution, we have the American Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, but then you just have eventually you have a new group in power. So yes, the old inequalities change, but then you have the bureaucrats or the PRI or whites or whatever now in control. So it changes the previous categorical inequality, but it produces new ones. So it's not really transformative in the long term for everybody, and a lot of people lose their lives. So is risky, but it's one way. So Charles Tilly talks about social movements as a way to end categorical inequality, to gain in group inequalities. And I'm finishing up a new edition of this textbook. I'm adding a lot of new case studies, Mexican movements, Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights, which I will talk briefly. But in that book, Tilly makes the argument that social movements, protests, which he calls contentious performances, or contentious politics, are the way for excluded groups, not individuals, excluded groups, as blacks, as LGBT, as Palestinians, to be asking for inclusion, to be asking for rights, to be asking for citizenship, right? Historically and today. He argues that indeed, with the formation of the nation state and the need for people to pay taxes and to serve in the military, the government had to give something in exchange, which is the citizenship. So citizens are asked for benefits in exchange for peace internally. So in the work that Tilly writes about democratization, he says that democracy is not a system, but it's a process. And it's, again, including everybody as citizens, not as indirect rule. I'm going to deal with the Jews here. I'm going to deal with the Catholics here. I'm going to deal with the Protestants, like Netherlands, those different pillars of society, or Germany. Here, it's like you as a citizen have the same rights. But when a group is excluded, they can use these group arguments to be included. So including all the groups that are excluded is a process that furthers democratization. People living in a territory, but they don't have the rights. And that trust networks, categorical groups, closed cliques, elites don't have more access to power, more influence to decision making, more resources without anything else being done. If you have the opposite, the concentration of power in a certain categorical group, you have de-democratization. Democracy is not a one-way street, it's not linear. You can have decreases in democratization. Tilly argues and demonstrates historically. All right, so 2 slides and I finish. So these 3 points that are kind of given away in terms of the social movements is that social movements historically arise asking a central authority far away from where you are for inclusion as a group that is being historically excluded. Civil rights is a great example. Catholics in a Protestant country like England or an Anglican country. Rights are won, not given. And that's an argument that he makes, rights for excluded groups. And in contentious politics, it means that a group has resources, and in order for that excluded group to become more equal, a group in power is going to lose some resources, or they feel they're going to lose resources. So therefore, it's not something that the governments give easily, or the people in power are like, oh yeah, you want it, here you go. Not that it's a zero-sum game, but it means a reshuffling. Then you're going to pay more expensive for labor. So there's something to be lost. So these are struggles that have to be won through protests, through the streets, because they're not going to be given. And let me finish with this example of immigrant rights movement today. And today I'm talking about this is a movement that has been going on for at least 20 years, right? And people are saying, we're here to stay, right? We work here, we pay taxes, we have children here, we speak English. We are within this border, within this nation state. We are human, following this post-Holocaust argument that no human is illegal. That's what Hitler said of Jews, and we had the Holocaust. Or New York saying you have a right, regardless of your background, you have rights to be here. You can ask protection from the city of New York if you are facing discrimination. Aquí estamos, no nos vamos. And the French they were doing a lot of, when I was in Paris, they were doing a lot of kind of sit-ins in the restaurants when they work. And they said, we work here, we stay here, we're not leaving. And they were able to ask as workers of a restaurant that where they were occupying, they were able to get papers at the work site level. It's something that in the US you would never see. But in the US you have, for example, journalists, Filipinos, and dreamers saying we're Americans, we're American, everything but on paper, right? Or people coming out, both in the sense of undocumented, but also in the sense of LGBT. And then the women's rights and other inclusion. So again, these are people that are, we are here, we live here, we're part of the American economy, the American society, but we're invisible, we don't have rights, right? So it reminds us of historical periods when groups, for belonging to a category, for the place where they were born or who they were born to, excluded, right? So this is something that the immigrant rights movement is saying, we want legalization for everybody, not only the DREAM Act, but all that. So again, this plays well into the creation of an excluded group, the foreigners, the immigrants, the non-citizens, who are, again, they're doing something here, right? playing sports, scientists, artists, for the most part labor, and that labor is making the economy growth, but they are not giving their due recognition and pay. So then movements are starting to form to say, we are here, we want to be recognized as part of the American fabric, regardless of our passport. So that's a little bit of the overview of a lot of my works. There's more to read in the books if you're interested. Thank you very much for your attention and for coming. And thank you. And I will open it up to questions and answers if anybody has any comments or questions. Yes, please.
Here in the United States, I am a Latino, and there's always this sense that the Latinos are being discriminated. But in turn, in Latin America, for instance, in Venezuela, they discriminate against other Latinos. And those Latinos, in turn, discriminate against other Latinos, right? So this is something that is like inherent to these categorical inequalities are inherent to human beings, or if they seem, even though reconstructed. So my question is there hope that we, at some point, will deconstruct these differences?
Good point. Yes, I mean, the fact that Mexicans are discriminated against or stigmatized in the U.S. doesn't negate the fact that in Mexico, Mexicans do the same to new immigrants. So it's the same process, it's the same mechanisms, it's the same construction of the other. As a Venezuelan in Mexico will always be a Venezuelan. But they're gonna learn the traditions, they're gonna learn the language, they're gonna assimilate. And also the Mexicans in the U.S., they become more like Americans through time and less like Mexicans, right? So these processes of exclusion and inclusion happen equally. So I think the point through the books, and I guess here in academia, in classrooms, in the university, is to educate ourselves that these categories are constructed, they're historical, they are not natural, they are not real. Therefore, we shouldn't take them so seriously. We're not lawyers, we're not immigration officials, so we don't have to say, you are not a citizen, don't ask for that. We should be more flexible about that. But again, it's normal nature to take care of your close ones first, your family, your friends. We all do it. But we have to be careful that the state doesn't replicate those tribal differences and ingrains them into the law, which the citizenship system kind of does a little bit. I mean, it's a complicated way to have to solve it, but we as citizens, we shouldn't, as political actors, we shouldn't exclude those who are part of the society, but they don't have the political rights. We have to give them a voice, but you have to convince your politicians. It's a complex process. Good question. More to talk about. Any other comments, questions? Yes, Alana.
Okay, so this is in reference to the chart that you had that laid out like Puerto Rican experience, Cuban experience, Dominican, and Mexican experience. Is there like an element of that which explores like aspects of colorism that might contribute to that? Because
yes.
I would definitely argue that colorism plays a large part in like where those different groups find themselves in society, class-wise.
Absolutely, yes, and Matthew talks about that. So how these different Caribbean groups are doing in the U.S. Part of it is that Dominicans or Puerto Ricans in the islands, they could be seen as upper class or as mulattoes, mixed race. But once they cross into the U.S., they become classified as black, and they are kind of treated with the racism that blacks are treated in America, and they have this downward assimilation path. Where a lot of the early Cuban immigrants were more on the Spanish side, they were whiter, so that also helped them with their integration. Phenotypically, they look more European. So yes, the colorism that they face in the U.S. Impacts their outcomes. And again, we have the colorism in Latin America too. Yeah. Good point.
Sort of follow up to that. With that being said, with the ending chart on how to solve or how to fix equality, how does that then play into that for the people that don't have passing as an option? Because I feel like that's not the best.
Well, no. Passing is only one case. It's a drop in the pocket. It doesn't change anything. So we cannot give everybody a chance at school or university so that everybody passes and then it's going to be gone. that will be very hard on practice. So it has to be a collective effort that even the people that pass are solidarious with the people that don't pass. But that's hard work, right? That's organizing, that's educating, that's creating a movement for a long period, because these are not things that can be won in a year or two. It's really for the long term. Yes, Nancy.
It was, I think, your third chart from the end had as its top bullet something along the lines of, when a social movement becomes effective, you're almost at the end of the previous state. I'm probably saying this wrong, but thinking now of the students' movement from Parkland,
Yes.
of the women's movement last year, right after the inauguration. Here we are. Social movements are about the end of categorical inequalities. That's a very hopeful statement.
They're about it. It doesn't mean that they end it, but a civil rights movement is like.
Oh, I read it wrong then. I read it as a timeline.
Yeah, no. It's like the.
You were saying that they are about creating the end of categorical
Yes,
inequalities.
that you can be.
Not that when a social movement comes about, we are about the end. Sorry.
No. Yeah, no.
It was really wishful.
It's when a group says, "Oh, I know we're excluded as a group. We don't like it. We want rights as the other groups that are not excluded."
Okay.
And sometimes it's won, sometimes it's not, right? So I think the civil rights is still ongoing. It hasn't been accomplished. But for example, in India, they got an independence, right? The Gandhi nationalistic movement was successful, right? You have, again, he provides a lot of historical examples. But such a movement, and then there's a question where new identity movements are about this or not. Because historically we saw social movements as class-based, but he says that it's more about groups. So you can see that with castes in India. The untouchables now, they mobilize, and now it's illegal to treat them as such, although there's still the cultural lag. Yes, Kay.
Is the French case really such an outlier that, because I'm ending categorical inequality, but in the French case, there isn't recognition of categorical inequality.
Right.
We both heard that other same lecture, and you've had more conversations, but so how do you place the French case, and particularly with regard to the social movements or to end, where do you put the French case? And what do we learn from the French case?
Great question. So yes, the French, out of principle, they say we're all equal, we have the same constitution, everybody's the same, we have human rights, so there's no real distinction between a citizen that is, whether he's Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, that's up to them, it's private, doesn't really matter. That's the discourse of the state, and people learn that and believe it and report it. But therefore, this public denial of these categorical inequalities makes mobilization along categorical lines almost impossible. There's not a North African movement. They tried in the 80s, it wasn't successful, it hasn't come up. It's also very hard for any minority to group as such. So the way I see it is a pessimistic story. It means that there's no peaceful avenues for this. So I think that it's not a coincidence that we have had this recurring existence of riots in France to channel a little bit of this discontent. Then the contentious politics is not to protest, marches, or peaceful means, but it's been. And again, it's not the immigrants, it's the children of color and the ones that are poor, marginalized, in the banlieues, in marginalized spaces. But I think these riots, like we saw in Washington some years ago, are when you don't see a way to that ending and you see that discontent and it's in your neighborhood with your friends and they just kill somebody that you know, that you have, and you see it, every time I go back to Paris, I see these boundaries between the French, the real French, the French, the Swiss, the white French, and the non, becoming more polarized, and people shouting at each other in the road, and it's becoming better and better. So I don't want to say that they're going to go into a civil war. It's not going to happen. It's a minority. But, and this is tricky, but a hypothesis, I cannot prove it, but a hypothesis is that you see more shooting of policemen by people of color or more terrorist attacks. Maybe these people, because they are a little bit left behind, they are more, and again, it's a minuscule 0.0001, but they are more likely to go to ISIS and fight and be prey to this enchantment. Whites in France do it and all that, But I think it's the U.S. case a little more hopeful. We're not there yet, but at least there's this language, this avenue, this organizing that is a possibility. In France, you can only do it along work rights or class-based rights, but because a lot of the people that are worse are not employed, they don't have access to that. So for me, the French case is the warning of what not to do. But again, I mean, I could be wrong.
I don't know if this is within the scope of your research, but do you know if there's a difference between like rural immigrant communities, like in California and New Mexico, versus urban communities? And I'm thinking specifically as the capacity for social movement. So like one of the largest movements in the United States has been led by Cesar Chavez in rural communities. So I don't know if you can speak to how objective or subjective integration is different.
That's a good question. I think cities provide this density and this scale that is very different than in small towns or rural areas. So most of my research in the receiving side has been in big cities. So because in a big city it's easy to see a lot of foreigners but not really interact with them. In a small town or a rural community, you are hiring those foreigners or you are working with them or they are your neighbors. So there's more opportunity for real knowledge, but also more opportunity for real disenchantment or not nice encounters. So I think the dynamics get a little bit, it's easier to be anonymous in the city, so that's helpful for the nativist and for the immigrant. In the countryside, it's a different dynamic, so I don't know enough about that, but I suspect it will be different. Yes?
Have you noticed in your fieldwork programs similar to the Bacero program that affects like ethnic identity in terms of like state programs trying to draw in labor from like surrounding countries?
Great point. So the Mexican migration to the U.S. gets started by the Bracero program. It was non-existent before that, and it was the very aggressive recruitment of employers going to central Mexico and promising the moon and the stars to Mexican labor to come and work in the U.S. So that was the start. And also it was the same thing with Algerians in France. They are recruited with guest worker programs around after the world wars to reconstruct France. So that starts this whole process. And again, it's problematic because they are, I guess that's the beginning of this, well, it's capitalism, right? But it's we want your labor, but we don't want you. So we come here, work for 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, and then go back home. We're not going to give you residency or citizenship. And the Turkish-German case is more extreme. So yes, it starts again with this demand for labor and these employers going and actively looking for them. Yeah, good point. All right, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you around.